This video is brought to you by Squarespace.
5 Hutt families on the distant world of Nal Hutta.
This territory is mine. Go back to Nal Hutta.
What's up, MetaNerds? This video will be a complete breakdown in history of the capital of the Hutt crime empire, Nal Hutta. A world that was originally known as Evacor, and is not the homeworld of the Hutt species. I'll get to that in a bit, but let's start by looking at this planet's location at grid coordinates S12 on the galactic map. Right at the intersection of major hyperspace highways that brought wealth into and sent vices out of the heart of Hutt space, all within the outer rim of the galaxy. At a diameter of 12,150 kilometers, it was about the same size as Coruscant, and had a Type 1 oxygen mix, a breathable atmosphere for a majority of species, along with standard gravity and a 315-day year, and an 87-hour-long day, within a star system that contained a single sun and 6 planets, totaling 27 moons. This is called the Tube system, and roughly around the year 15,000 BBY, the Hutt invasion of Evacor began following the environmental destruction of their homeworld, Varl. There were some small Hutt colonies on the surface for hundreds of years before this, but it was still mostly controlled by the native Evocii. Once the Hutt homeworld was inhospitable, the major families decided to launch an all-out war. A war of legal technicalities, with armies of lawyers that drew up contracts and exchanged native lands for alien high-tech devices. Any Republic advisors brought in couldn't dispute these legal purchases, and as you could predict, they kept buying more and more land until the natives were pushed into a tiny area. As the Evocii could tell where this was going, some of them fled to the moon of Nar Shaddaa. Hindsight is 2020, and it's only obvious now that if they wanted to flee the debauchery and crime-ridden society of the Hutts, Nar Shaddaa was even worse than Nal Hutta, as the planet's moon was even more pleasant to a variety of species, becoming a sort of evil brother to Coruscant, with endless neon-covered buildings housing everything from gambling to slave and spice markets. A world where there was no concept of the term legal or illegal. In that, these worlds were similar, but Nal Hutta was for the Hutts from then on out. The once massive trees that made up the planet-spanning rainforests were flattened, and without them the swamps increased in size to almost completely cover this world. Some of this work to destroy Evacor was actually done by the remaining Evocii, who were captured as slaves and made to operate the machines that would tear down the last remnants of their civilization, as none of their architecture remains even as far back as 3500 BBY. These little genocides were just what came with running a galaxy-spanning crime empire. And they were incensed when an Evocii named Huttsbane started launching terrorist attacks on the refined Hutt cultural centers. As Suda Nemro lamented, the Evocii sold us this world for trinkets. Now they take up arms against their rightful masters. It's disgusting. With the incredibly thick atmosphere keeping everything constantly moist with showers and layers of fog, and now a global swamp headquarters right next to the rapidly expanding Sin capital of Nar Shaddaa, the Hutts finally had a world they could call home, at least until this one ran into a complete environmental collapse as well. And they would call it the Glorious Jewel, and as Borga the Hutt would put it, quote, "In fact, we Hutts know a good deal about remaking worlds. When we arrived here from Varl, for example, Glorious Jewel was not the paradise you see now, but a primitive world of dense forests and untamed seas. Though to outsiders, this world was still a bit dreary and horrifying, with dragon snakes that would lay in wait under the thick, muddy waters, using their dozens of movement detection organs to pounce on any unsuspecting prey that it came across, often nesting in gnarled tree roots, which are also home to the Shirelian Toops, small starfish-like creatures that developed a symbiotic relationship with the Hutts, being able to clean up bacteria and food stuck under the flaps of skin. And over time, these became a fashion accessory, being worn by both Marlowe and Mama Hutt as headpieces.
You gon' sit in your stank, and you gon' pass the slime pods.
Slime pods were little organisms that were scooped up to make one of their favorite dishes, and would have blue glowing algae growing alongside it. While the skies were filled with these floating creatures and a pterodactyl-like bird, which did not appear to be registered on any galactic databases. And as their industry grew, chemical waste proved to be delicious to the then named Chemilizard that could reach up to 20 meters long. With this planet as their HQ, the Hutt families would continue to grow the economy of Nar Shaddaa, to the point that this area of space was considered an equal or even larger economy than Coruscant for the following 11,000 years. Some dark HoloNet conspiracy theorists think that it's suspicious that just as the Sith Empire was rising, the Utmian-Pabal hyperspace route collapsed when a nearby star went supernova, having the effect of drastically cutting off the trade to this Hutt-controlled area. rapidly accelerating the economy of the Republic capital of Coruscant at just the right time. This pushed the Hutts even deeper into the vice trade, and so these planets focused on what they were good at, Hutt space dominating the gray and black market goods, knowing that even if Coruscant got the big legit businesses, their leaders and politicians loved the vices bought in Hutt space, and their economy still depended on the key elements like bounty hunters, slavers, and data slicers, that were all still well under the control of the Hutt families. The 5 Hutt families was the informal term for the Council of Elders, the governing body of all Hutt space since the fall of their homeworld Varl, and since the taking of Nal Hutta in 15,000 BBY, they would stay in power from then on out, making this government one of the longest existing in the entire galaxy. The Elders could only come from the clans of the Ancients, which were the powerful families since their time on Varl. The clans Vosadi, Vandarajar, Jarama, Kajadir, Gorensla, Barish, Konalak, Basadi, and Dasilijic. And these families proved strong enough to retain this area of space, even as the Sith Empire would send countless spies to sow division on Nal Hutta and Nar Shaddaa, hoping to prop up local gangs and rival Hutt families.
We believe Nemro has been reluctant to lose Republic customers by publicly siding with the Empire. It's time he overcame this reluctance. We need to know what Nemro and his advisors are thinking before we can act. I want you to obtain access to the Nemro clan's inner circle.
One of the most famous from the Clone Wars era would be Gardula Basadi the Elder, the once ruler of Tatooine before Jabba of the Dasilijic clan was able to wrestle control from her. By 21 BBY, she would call an assembly of the Hutt ruling families to meet at her palace on Nal Hutta, in order to discuss the fate of Zero the Hutt, who stole invaluable and incriminating Hutt council records to protect himself. Of course, the Coruscanti politicians and major corporations would not be surprised at the connections to industries and extravagances coming from Hutt space, but the public would go through a short-term outrage that would be bad for business, and might even lead to some theatrical justice being dealt out, a use of force that might result in the killing off of some Hutt or lower-level crime lord. For causing all this trouble, Zero would be detained in the massive dungeon of the Basadi Palace, and keep in mind that all the families had palaces like these all over Nal Hutta, and even some from up-and-coming families that were not one of the clans of the Ancients. These palaces were made from the thick gnarl woods and shaped mud, but made for the perfect climate for the Hutts. And the more common buildings were of course smaller, but almost all structures on this planet are built using the same method. From Zero's mama's hut to rows of housing and shops, all built using this natural method. A funny irony from a species known for causing environmental destruction, but luckily once they got Nal Hutta from rainforest to swamp, at least this swamp was ideal for them, and now they almost live harmoniously with nature. To travel across this world, they would use an airboat-like hovercraft, or for long distance just go by starship. Their largest city was Bibosa, the capital, which contained the largest spaceport on Nal Hutta, and was always seeing a constant stream of shady visitors of every species. The bazaar would lead to eateries, cantinas, and pawn shops like Pablo's, which had just about every piece of armor and weaponry you could hope for.
Pablo's pawn shop has everything a bounty hunter needs, and more.
Even having pieces of clone trooper armor for sale. Given how large-scale the Clone Wars were, it is very reasonable to assume that anything that touched the battlefront, from DC-15 blasters to droidicas, all could be purchased in Hutt space for the right amount of credits. In this hub, we can see that everything is under strict Hutt control, using mostly Nikto and Gamorrean guards on constant patrol, because even the underworld should be orderly. But this didn't mean they could protect you from being swindled in clever ways.
So you only gave him enough fuel to reach the nearest filling station on Arandia, which is owned by your brother. Well, that's a nice little money-making scam.
Now this world, the crime lord's Coruscant and seat of Hutt power, would go unchallenged for most of its history, affording the Hutts the chance to align themselves with either the Republic or Separatists or just stay neutral. Only tipping over to allow the Republic to use their space when Dooku was revealed to be the one behind the kidnapping of Jabba's son, Rhoda. The only one to ever force them into anything was Darth Maul, when he formed the Shadow Collective, using Death Watch Mandalorian forces to snowball his takeover of smaller crime syndicates like Black Sun, triggering the Pike Syndicate to voluntarily join to avoid conflict. And he was now brazen enough to take these forces directly to the Council in meeting on Nal Hutta. Imagine their disbelief as these long-lived leaders, the unopposed heads of clans that had ruled for 15,000 years, sitting in a palace on a homeworld they created, and hear the small humanoid say,
"Your lives, in exchange for Hutt space and everything in its borders."
This was not taken well, and as you would imagine, it's one of the most protected places in the galaxy, as hordes of bounty hunters and palace guards would spring up from behind the Hutt seats and from every nook and cranny of the building. Intense fighting that pushed the invaders out, only for the Mando reinforcements to help push back and take the council room. Protocols were in place for this unlikely event, and all the Hutts were able to quickly flee to their ships and were well off world by now, all except Aruba.
So the only thing that you can tell me is that I will find Jabba at Jabba's palace.
After he was killed, the Shadow Collective immediately rushed to Tatooine, and with Mandalorian starfighters and ground troops, they quickly overtook Jabba's palace, storming into the throne room to find Jabba and Gorga, who revealed that the Hutt elders had come to a new decision.
The mighty Jabba and the Hutt families have decided to join you.
Even into the Imperial and following New Republic era, the Hutts would retain control of Hutt space. These long-lived slugs knowing how to keep politicians in check by the use of credits, vice, and blackmail, and like with Darth Maul, cooperating just enough to retain their own power, or to allow those in power on Coruscant to save face. Though legends say they finally met their match in the year 26 ABY, where they tried to backstab the extragalactic Yuuzhan Vong, who promptly retaliated with an orbital bombardment. The Vong would reduce both Nal Hutta and Nar Shaddaa to a rich soil bed, literally using the organic tech, mostly advanced bacteria, to pump into the atmosphere of these worlds and break down both machines and people into a nutrient-rich dirt. In the relative blink of an eye, these masters of terraforming to create their unique living industries and technologies, called Vong forming, would prove to be the second time Nal Hutta was drastically changed to suit its new lords. What remained of the Hutt cartels were scattered across the stars, and forced to set up a new, sad and broken version of the ruling council on Tatooine, a world that couldn't be farther from their beloved, hazy, moist, and slimy swamp. And over the following decades after the Vong were defeated, some Hutts would try to make it back to their glorious jewel, though it would never again be the seat of Hutt power, or nearly as beautiful in their eyes as it was in the days of old. So that's it for its history and breakdown, but you definitely want to hear these cool facts and behind the scenes stuff. The depiction of Gardulla's palace was something George Lucas had in his mind for decades, imagining the Hutts living in bulbous structures that rose up out of the foggy swamp. And it was only for the Clone Wars that the world received a large ring, but it also became more green, perhaps showing nature recovering from the Hutt's original deforestation and becoming a healthy, proper swampland, while also generating more space debris from waste and destroyed ships accumulating over thousands of years. The Khajiitic banners, or logos of the crime syndicate run by each family, were originally in the concept art right in front of their corresponding Hutt, but in the episode we see that the banners are between them, and that they do not always sit in the same seats. An interesting sort of humbleness among these cutthroat gangsters, perhaps showing a lessening of the individual and clan, and deference to the council as an entity, where they were all equal, sitting by banners that were not your own, but of your fellow clan elders. A nice touch in theory, even if the Hutts often plotted against and killed each other. And it's unclear why Zero's father's tomb would be on Teth, not Nal Hutta. Perhaps it has something to do with the dry environment, or that Teth was considered a more spiritual place to be buried, as it was a major Hutt cultural world, once ruled by the Ba'omar monks, who also built Jabba's palace on Tatooine. If you made it this far, please hit that like button and subscribe, and be sure to check out the link down below for 10% off Squarespace. Squarespace allows you to connect with your audience and generate revenue through gated, members-only content, manage your members, send email communications, and leverage audience insights, all on one easy-to-use platform. Community is key to building your website, and their fully integrated commenting system supports threaded comments, replies, and likes. There are also third-party extensions that are great for e-commerce, like streamlined bookkeeping, product promotion, and inventory management, and can automatically push content from your social media channels. The best way to make your website the all-in-one hub you've dreamed of. So use the link in the description to go to squarespace.com for a free trial. And when you're ready to launch, head over to squarespace.com/MetaNerdz to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Thanks again to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. And thanks to our supporters over on Patreon. For just $1, you'll be added to this list. And special shout out to our $25 tier supporters, Bill Payne, Brandon Robinson, and Oscar Jones. But most important of all, remember, one man's toxic swamp is another Hutt's glorious jewel. And the Force will be with you, always.